17-year-old Willard Noble Chaden Miller stood before Jefferson County District Court Judge Sean Showers in Fairfield, Iowa, on July 5, 2023, wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and shackles, his head bowed as Judge Showers prepared to sentence him for the first-degree murder of 66-year-old Nohema Graber, the beloved Spanish teacher at Fairfield High School, whom Willard and his best friend Jeremy Goodale had brutally beaten to death with a baseball bat in Chautauqua Park on November 2, 2021, when both boys were just 16 years old, killing their teacher by striking her repeatedly in the head until she died, all because Mrs. Graber had given Willard a bad grade in her Spanish class that was lowering his GPA and threatening his academic standing. Before we continue with this shocking case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. For the 20 months between the murder in November 2021 and the sentencing hearing in July 2023, investigators, prosecutors, and the tight-knit community of Fairfield, a small Iowa town of approximately 9,400 people where violent crime was almost unheard of, and where Nohema Graber had taught Spanish and touched countless students' lives, decades, tried to comprehend how two seemingly normal teenage boys, honor students with no prior criminal records, could meticulously plan and execute the murder of their teacher simply because one of them was unhappy with his grade. The case generated national headlines and sparked intense debate about teenage violence, academic pressure, and the question of what could drive two 16-year-olds to commit such a heinous act over something as trivial as a grade in a high school Spanish class. But what truly shocked the courtroom during Willard Miller's sentencing hearing was the moment when Willard's own parents, who had sat through every hearing and maintained a presence of support for their son throughout the legal proceedings, heard the full details of how Willard had recruited his friend Jeremy to help murder Mrs. Graber, how they had spent 2 weeks planning every detail of the killing, how Willard had met with Mrs. Graber the day before her murder to discuss his grade while already knowing he intended to kill her the next day, and how, after beating her to death with a baseball bat, they had dragged her body into the woods and covered it with a tarp, all because Willard was angry about his academic performance. According to courtroom observers and media reports, the moment when prosecutors revealed the extent of Willard's cold calculation and the trivial motive anger over a grade, not abuse or trauma or any comprehensible reason, but simply academic frustration. Willard's parents visibly recoiled, and while they didn't formally disown him in the legal sense, their body language and later statements suggested they struggled to recognize their son in the monster described by prosecutors, a transformation that was evident to everyone in the courtroom as they watched a family grapple with the incomprehensible reality of what their child had done. Willard Noble Chaden Miller was born in 2005 in Fairfield, Iowa, into what appeared to be a stable middle-class family that valued education, achievement, and community involvement. Fairfield is a small city in southeast Iowa, known for its strong sense of community, its excellent schools, and its relatively low crime rate, the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where teachers are respected members of the community, and where families raise their children with the expectation that they will grow up to be productive, law-abiding citizens. Willard's childhood and early adolescence seemed to fit perfectly into this wholesome small-town narrative. He was a good student, participated in school activities, had friends, and showed no obvious warning signs of violence or serious behavioral problems. By the time Willard entered Fairfield High School, he had established himself as an academically capable student who cared deeply about his grades and his class rank. Fairfield High School, like many high schools in competitive academic environments, tracked students' grade point averages and class rankings, creating a culture where students compared their GPAs and competed for positions that would help them gain admission to good colleges and qualify for scholarships. For some students, this competitive academic environment provides healthy motivation to work hard and achieve their potential. But for others, particularly those who tie their entire sense of self-worth to their academic performance. The pressure to maintain perfect grades can become overwhelming and destructive. Willard Miller fell into the latter category. According to later testimony and evidence presented at trial, Willard became increasingly obsessed with his GPA and class rank during his sophomore year at Fairfield High School in 2021. He was taking multiple advanced and honors classes, participating in extracurricular activities, and trying to maintain the kind of academic record that would position him for admission to competitive universities. Every grade mattered to Willard. Every percentage point on every assignment was scrutinized, and any grade that fell below his expectations was treated as a personal catastrophe rather than a normal part of the learning process. In the fall of 2021, Willard was enrolled in Spanish class taught by Nohema Graber, a 66-year-old educator who had been teaching at Fairfield High School for years and who was beloved by students and colleagues for her dedication, her warmth, and her commitment to helping students learn. Mrs. Graber was exactly the kind of teacher every school hopes to have experienced. Caring, demanding but fair. Someone who pushed students to do their best, while also showing compassion and understanding when they struggled. She had taught hundreds of students over her career, many of whom credited her with inspiring their love of languages and cultures, and she was planning to retire soon after decades of service to Fairfield students. But Willard Miller didn't see Mrs. Graber as a dedicated educator who was trying to help him learn Spanish. He saw her as an obstacle to his academic goals, as someone whose grading standards were preventing him from achieving the GPA he believed he deserved. According to evidence presented at trial, Willard became increasingly frustrated with his grade in Mrs. Graber's class during the fall semester of 2021. He believed she was grading too harshly, that her teaching methods were inadequate, that she wasn't giving him the grades he deserved for his work. Rather than accepting that he might need to work harder or seek extra help to improve his performance, the normal, healthy response to struggling in a class, Willard externalized all the blame onto Mrs. Graber, convincing himself that she was the problem and that his poor grade was entirely her fault. This kind of thinking, blaming others for one's own shortcomings, refusing to accept responsibility for poor performance, viewing teachers as adversaries rather than helpers, is concerning but not uncommon among teenagers, particularly high-achieving students who have tied their identities to their academic success. Most students who feel this way eventually gain perspective, learn to handle disappointment, and recognize that grades don't define their worth as human beings. But for Willard Miller, the frustration and resentment toward Mrs. Graber festered and grew into something far more dangerous. Jeremy Everett Goodale was Willard's best friend, a fellow student at Fairfield High School, who was also 16 years old in the fall of 2021. Jeremy came from a similar background to Willard, a middle-class family in Fairfield. No documented history of violence or serious behavioral problems. Reasonably good student, someone who seemed to be on a normal trajectory toward graduating high school and building an adult life. Jeremy and Willard had been close friends for some time, the kind of intense adolescent friendship where the two boys spent most of their free time together, confided in each other, and formed what appeared from the outside to be a healthy peer relationship. But beneath the surface, the friendship between Willard and Jeremy had a darker dimension. According to later evidence and testimony, Willard was the dominant personality in the friendship, with Jeremy being more passive and follower-like, willing to go along with Willard's ideas and plans, even when those plans were questionable or wrong. This dynamic, a dominant leader paired with a follower willing to participate in the leader's schemes, is a pattern that appears in many cases where two people commit crimes together, with one person initiating and driving the criminal plan, while the other goes along due to loyalty, fear of losing the friendship, or their own moral deficits. In October 2021, approximately 2 weeks before Mrs. Graber's murder, Willard approached Jeremy with a shocking proposal. He wanted to kill their Spanish teacher, and he wanted Jeremy to help him do it. According to Jeremy's later testimony, Willard explained that Mrs. Graber was ruining his GPA with her bad grades, that he had tried to talk to her about improving his grade, but she wouldn't give him the grade he wanted, and that the only solution was to kill her. Willard didn't present this as an impulsive fantasy or idle, angry talk. He told Jeremy he was serious, that he had already started planning how they would do it, and that he needed Jeremy's help to carry out the murder. Most teenagers, if approached by a friend with such a horrifying plan, would immediately refuse and would likely report the plan to parents, school officials, or police. The normal moral development that occurs during adolescence equips most teenagers with a clear understanding that murder is wrong, that killing someone over a grade is insane, and that friendship doesn't extend to helping someone commit murder. But Jeremy Goodale didn't refuse, didn't report the plan, and didn't try to talk Willard out of it. Instead, Jeremy agreed to help Willard kill Mrs. Graber. Why Jeremy agreed to participate in such an obviously evil plan remains a subject of debate. At his own sentencing hearing nearly 2 years later, Jeremy would claim he regretted his decision and that he should have refused, but he never provided a satisfactory explanation for why he agreed to help murder an innocent woman. Some experts speculated that Jeremy was so enmeshed in his friendship with Willard that he couldn't imagine refusing and potentially losing the friendship. Others suggested Jeremy had his own antisocial tendencies and moral deficits that made him capable of participating in murder, even if he didn't originate the plan. Still others pointed to the adolescent brain's underdeveloped capacity for risk assessment and long-term thinking, suggesting Jeremy might not have fully grasped the reality and consequences of what they were planning. Whatever Jeremy's reasons, once he agreed to help, Willard and Jeremy began planning Mrs. Graber's murder in earnest. According to evidence presented at trial, the two boys spent approximately 2 weeks in October 2021 discussing and refining their plan. They talked about how they would kill Mrs. Graber, where they would do it, how they would dispose of her body, and how they would avoid getting caught. They decided they would ambush Mrs. Graber during her daily walk in Chautauqua Park, a location where she was known to go regularly after school. Information they had learned, either through observation or through their interactions with her as her students. They planned to bring baseball bats as weapons, to attack her on the walking trail where there would be fewer witnesses, and to drag her body into the woods where it might not be found for some time. The cold calculation and premeditation evident in their planning was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion, wasn't an impulsive act committed in a moment of anger. This was a carefully planned execution that took weeks to orchestrate. Willard and Jeremy discussed every detail, considered potential problems and how to solve them, and made conscious choices at every step that brought them closer to committing murder. At any point during those 2 weeks, either boy could have changed his mind, could have recognized the evil of what they were planning, could have sought help or simply refused to go through with it. But neither did. On Monday, November 1st, 2021, the day before the murder, Willard met with Mrs. Graber after class to discuss his grade in her Spanish course. According to investigators, Willard used this meeting to ask Mrs. Graber about his grade, to complain about his performance, and to try to negotiate for a better grade. Mrs. Graber, like any professional educator, explained her grading policies, discussed what Willard could do to improve his grade through better performance on future assignments, and presumably tried to help him understand that grades reflect effort and mastery, rather than being arbitrary numbers to be negotiated. But Willard wasn't meeting with Mrs. Graber to genuinely discuss academic improvement. According to later evidence, he was already committed to killing her the next day and was using this meeting either to solidify his resolve, to scope out her routine, or perhaps to give himself one last chance to see if she would give him the grade he wanted and thereby save herself. When Mrs. Graber maintained her professional grading standards and didn't simply award Willard an unearned higher grade, he left the meeting, knowing he would proceed with the murder plan the next day. And time. On Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021, and 21, Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale, brought their plan to fruition. According to evidence presented at trial and Jeremy's later testimony, the two boys armed themselves with baseball bats and went to Chautauqua Park in Fairfield, knowing from Mrs. Graber's routine that she would go there for her daily walk after school. Chautauqua Park was a location where Mrs. Graber regularly exercised, walking along trails through the wooded area as part of her healthy lifestyle, a routine that was well known to people who knew her, including her students. Mrs. Graber arrived at the park that afternoon, parked her van in the parking area, and set off on her walk along the trail, completely unaware that two of her students were waiting to ambush and murder her. Witnesses would later report seeing Mrs. Graber's van leaving the park less than an hour after she had arrived. But Mrs. Graber wasn't driving. Willard and Jeremy were in the front seats, having already killed their teacher and planning to dispose of her body. According to Jeremy Goodale's testimony during his own legal proceedings, the attack occurred on the walking trail in the park. Willard and Jeremy ambushed Mrs. Graber, and Willard struck her with his baseball bat. After he had struck Nohema Graber, he then moved her off of the trail, where I then struck her, and she died as a result, Jeremy testified, describing in chilling matter-of-fact language how he and Willard had beaten their teacher to death. The two boys struck Mrs. Graber repeatedly with baseball bats, hitting her in the head until she died from the catastrophic head trauma. The attack was brutal and sustained. This wasn't a single blow in a moment of passion, but rather a sustained beating that continued until Mrs. Graber was dead. After murdering Mrs. Graber, Willard and Jeremy dragged or carried her body off the trail and into a wooded area where it would be less visible to people walking the trail. They covered her body with a tarp or other materials in an attempt to conceal it, demonstrating continued deliberation and consciousness of guilt even after the murder. Then the two boys walked back to where Mrs. Graber's van was parked, got into the vehicle, and drove it away from the park. The act of stealing Mrs. Graber's van demonstrated that Willard and Jeremy were thinking clearly and making rational decisions. Even immediately after committing murder, they weren't in a dissociative state or overcome with emotion, but rather were executing the cover-up plan they had prepared in advance. Willard and Jeremy drove Mrs. Graber's van to a rural location and abandoned it, then apparently made their way back to Fairfield by some other means, possibly walking, getting a ride from someone, or using bicycles or other transportation they had staged as part of their plan. They attempted to remove evidence from the van and from their persons that might link them to the murder. Then both boys went home and tried to act as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just brutally murdered their Spanish teacher in a park and left her body hidden in the woods. Mrs. Graber's body was discovered in Chautauqua Park on November 3, 2021, the day after the murder, when she failed to return home and concerned family members and colleagues reported her missing. The discovery of her beaten body hidden in the woods shocked the Fairfield community. Violent crime, especially murder, was extraordinarily rare in this small Iowa town, and the idea that someone had killed beloved teacher Nohema Graber was almost incomprehensible. The immediate question was who would want to harm Mrs. Graber, a respected educator with no known enemies. No obvious reason anyone would target her for violence. The investigation into Mrs. Graber's murder was led by the Fairfield Police Department with assistance from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and other law enforcement agencies. Investigators processed the crime scene in Chautauqua Park, recovering physical evidence from where Mrs. Graber's body had been found and from the trail where she had been attacked. They located Mrs. Graber's van abandoned in a rural area and processed it for evidence. And they began interviewing people who knew Mrs. Graber, trying to identify potential suspects and establish who had been in the park on the afternoon of November 2nd. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: social media and a concerned witness who came forward with screenshots of a Snapchat conversation. According to investigators, Jeremy Goodale had apparently communicated with someone via Snapchat about the murder. either bragging about what he had done or discussing the crime in a way that implicated himself and Willard. A witness who had seen these Snapchat messages either as a direct recipient or through screenshots that were being shared recognized the seriousness of what they were seeing and contacted police, providing the screenshots that pointed to Jeremy Goodale and Willard Miller as the killers. This was the kind of mistake that demonstrates how poorly teenagers often understand technology and digital evidence. Jeremy apparently thought that Snapchat messages would disappear and couldn't be used as evidence, not realizing that recipients could take screenshots before the messages disappeared, that those screenshots could be shared and forwarded, and that digital communications leave traces even when users think they've been deleted. The decision to communicate about the murder via social media, whether Jeremy was bragging, confiding in someone, or simply being careless, was the error that led police directly to him and Willard. On November 5, 2021, just 3 days after the murder, police arrested both Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale and charged them with first-degree murder in connection with Mrs. Graber's death. Both boys were 16 years old at the time of their arrest. Juveniles, aged 16 and older, who are charged with certain serious offenses, including first-degree murder, are automatically prosecuted as adults, meaning Willard and Jeremy would face adult penalties, including potentially life in prison, if convicted. During interrogation, both boys eventually admitted their roles in Mrs. Graber's murder, though the details they provided differed slightly, and each tried to minimize his own culpability while emphasizing the other's role. Willard Miller told investigators about his frustrations with Mrs. Graber's grading and teaching methods, explaining how his grade in her class was lowering his GPA and threatening his academic standing. He described these frustrations as if they were legitimate grievances that somehow justified or at least explained the murder, apparently not grasping that being upset about a grade is something millions of students experience without resorting to murder. I was frustrated with the way she taught Spanish and with how my grade in her class was lowering my GPA, Willard told police. According to testimony at later hearings, the statement revealed Willard's self-centered worldview and his failure to take responsibility for his own academic performance. In Willard's mind, his poor grade was entirely Mrs. Graber's fault for how she taught and graded, not his fault for his own lack of effort or mastery of the material. This externalization of blame, this inability to accept that he was responsible for his own academic outcomes, was central to understanding how Willard could convince himself that murdering his teacher was somehow justified or necessary. The arrests of Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale sent shockwaves through Fairfield High School and the broader community. These weren't troubled kids from broken homes with long histories of violence. They were honor students, kids from seemingly stable families, teenagers who had been sitting in class and participating in school activities just days before their arrest. The idea that two 16-year-old boys could plan and execute the murder of their teacher simply because one of them was unhappy with his grade was almost impossible for most people to comprehend. The case generated intense media coverage, with national news outlets picking up the story of the Iowa teens who killed their Spanish teacher over a bad grade. The case became a focal point for discussions about academic pressure on teenagers, about the potential for seemingly normal kids to commit shocking violence, and about how two families and a community could have missed any warning signs that might have predicted such a horrific crime. As the case proceeded through the legal system, both Willard and Jeremy were held without bond pending trial. Their families hired defense attorneys who faced the difficult task of defending clients whose guilt was not seriously in dispute. Both boys had confessed. Physical and digital evidence tied them to the crime, and the facts clearly established that they had planned and executed Mrs. Graber's murder together. The question for the defense wasn't whether the boys had killed Mrs. Graber, but whether they could present any mitigation that might result in something less than the maximum possible penalty. For Willard Miller's family, the months following his arrest were a nightmare of trying to reconcile the son They thought they knew what the murderer he had proven himself to be. Willard's parents attended court hearings, presumably visited him in custody, and tried to understand how their son, who had been raised with moral values, who had been a good student and seemingly good kid, could have planned and executed the murder of an innocent woman over something as trivial as a grade. The question of what they had missed, what warning signs they should have seen, would haunt them. In April 2023, approximately 17 months after the murder, Willard Miller pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for prosecutors agreeing not to seek additional charges or enhanced penalties. The guilty plea meant the case would proceed directly to sentencing without a trial, sparing Mrs. Graber's family and the community the trauma of a lengthy trial, but also preventing full public disclosure of all the evidence and details of the crime. Under Iowa law, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison, but juveniles sentenced to life are eligible to petition for parole after serving a minimum number of years. The specific number would be determined by the judge at sentencing. Willard Miller's sentencing hearing was held on July 5, 2023, before Judge Sean Showers in Jefferson County District Court. The courtroom was packed with Mrs. Graber's family members, community members who had known and loved her, media covering the case, and Willard's own family, who came to support their son despite the horror of what he had done. The hearing would include victim impact statements from Mrs. Graber's loved ones, arguments from prosecutors about the appropriate sentence, mitigation testimony from defense witnesses, and ultimately Judge Showers' sentencing decision. The victim impact statements, delivered by Mrs. Graber's family and friends, were heart-wrenching and powerful. Family members described Nohema Graber as a dedicated educator who loved teaching, who cared deeply about her students, who had touched countless lives over her decades in the classroom. They described her as a loving wife, mother, grandmother, and friend, someone whose warmth and kindness had enriched everyone who knew her. They spoke about their devastating loss, about the permanent hole Mrs. Graber's murder had left in their lives, about their grief and anger that she had been killed by one of her own students simply because he was unhappy with his grade. Nohema dedicated her life to teaching, to helping young people learn and grow. One family member said through tears, she cared about her students. She wanted them to succeed, and one of those students murdered her because he didn't like his grade. How do we make sense of that? How do we understand that level of selfishness and evil? Prosecutors presented the full timeline and details of the murder, emphasizing the extensive premeditation and planning that Willard and Jeremy had engaged in over the 2-week period before the killing. Deputy prosecutors described how Willard had recruited Jeremy to help commit murder, how they had planned every detail of the attack, how Willard had met with Mrs. Graber the day before to discuss his grade while already planning to kill her, how they had ambushed her on her walk and beaten her to death with baseball bats, and how they had hidden her body and stolen her van in an attempt to cover up their crime. The prosecutors emphasized that this was not an impulsive act or a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated execution carried out by 2 teenagers who made conscious choices at every step. Most damning was the prosecutor's emphasis on Willard's motive. He killed Mrs. Graber because he was unhappy with his grade, not because she had abused him, not because she had threatened him, not because of any legitimate grievance or comprehensible reason, simply because he felt entitled to a better grade than his performance had earned, and she refused to give him an unearned grade. The triviality of the motive, the complete disproportion between the wrong Willard felt he had suffered and his response of murder, demonstrated the depth of his narcissism and moral deficiency. When it came time for the defense to present mitigation, Willard's attorneys faced a nearly impossible task. They presented testimony about Willard's age, 16 at the time of the murder, his lack of prior criminal record, his academic achievements, and his family background, arguing that these factors demonstrated Willard had rehabilitative potential and shouldn't be condemned to die in prison. They presented psychological testimony suggesting that Willard's adolescent brain was still developing and that he lacked the full capacity for judgment and impulse control that adults possess. But these mitigation arguments were undercut by the facts of the case. The extensive planning and premeditation demonstrated that Willard wasn't acting impulsively, but was making calculated decisions over a period of weeks. His academic achievements made the triviality of his motive, killing someone over a grade, even more incomprehensible, rather than explaining or excusing it. And his lack of prior criminal record, while technically a mitigating factor, also meant there had been no prior warning signs or interventions that might have prevented the murder. When Willard himself was given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing, he stood before Judge Showers and delivered what appeared to be a prepared statement expressing remorse. "I made terrible decisions that led to Mrs. Graber's death," Willard said, according to courtroom observers. "I am sorry for what I did. I know I can never undo it. Whatever sentence you give me is what I deserve." The statement hit many of the expected notes: acknowledgement of responsibility, expression of remorse, acceptance of consequences, but observers noted that Willard's delivery seemed rehearsed and lacking in genuine emotion, as if he were reciting lines he had been coached to say, rather than expressing authentic regret and grief for the life he had taken. Judge Sean Showers, who had presided over the case since Willard's arrest, then delivered his sentencing decision. Judge Showers made clear that he found Willard's crime to be particularly heinous due to the extensive premeditation, the betrayal of the teacher-student relationship, and especially the trivial motive. This was not a crime of passion or impulse, Judge Showers said from the bench. This was a calculated, planned execution of a woman who had dedicated her life to teaching and who trusted you as her student. You killed her because you were unhappy with your grade, a reason so trivial and self-centered that it demonstrates a profound moral deficiency. Mrs. Graber deserved to live. She deserved to retire and enjoy her golden years with her family. You took that from her for the most selfish of reasons. Judge Showers sentenced Willard Miller to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. This meant Willard would not be eligible to even petition for parole until he had served a minimum of 35 years in prison, meaning he would be at least 51 years old before he could even ask a parole board to consider releasing him, and there would be no guarantee of parole even after 35 years. The sentence ensured that Willard would spend his entire young adulthood and middle age in prison, serving time for the murder he committed when he was 16. According to courtroom observers and later media reports, the moment during the proceedings when the full details of Willard's motive and planning became clear when prosecutors laid out how Willard had planned murder for 2 weeks, had met with Mrs. Graber to discuss his grade while already intending to kill her, and had killed her simply because he felt entitled to a better grade, was the moment when Willard's parents' expressions changed. While they didn't stand up and formally disown Willard or denounce him publicly, their body language and facial expressions reportedly showed shock, grief, and what appeared to be a loss of recognition, as if they were seeing their son clearly for the first time and realizing he was not the person they had believed him to be. The horror of learning that your child is capable of murder is something most parents cannot fully imagine until they experience it. Willard's parents had raised him, loved him, supported his academic achievements, and presumably tried to instill good values and moral development. But somehow, despite their efforts, they had raised a son who could plan murder for 2 weeks, could beat his teacher to death with a baseball bat, and could do all of this over something as trivial as a grade. The cognitive dissonance between the son they thought they knew and the murderer he had proven himself to be must have been almost unbearable. The case of Willard Miller and his co-defendant Jeremy Goodale, who was sentenced separately in November 2023 to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, receiving a somewhat shorter minimum sentence due to his more cooperative testimony and apparently lesser role in planning the murder, generated widespread discussion about several important issues. First, The case highlighted the extreme and sometimes dangerous academic pressure that some teenagers experience in competitive school environments. The pressure to achieve perfect grades, to rank at the top of the class, to build the kind of academic record that will guarantee admission to elite universities for some students. This pressure becomes so intense that they lose all perspective about what really matters in life. Grades are important, and academic achievement can open doors, but no grade is worth killing for, and the student who cannot accept a less than perfect grade without resorting to violence has a serious moral and psychological deficiency that goes far beyond normal academic stress. Second, the case raised questions about how two seemingly normal teenagers with no prior violence could plan and execute such a horrific crime. Willard and Jeremy weren't the stereotypical troubled kids from broken homes with long histories of behavioral problems. They were honor students from stable families in a good school and community. Yet they proved capable of murdering their teacher over a trivial grievance. This challenged common assumptions about being able to identify potentially violent individuals based on obvious warning signs and raised uncomfortable questions about whether any teenager might be capable of such violence under the right circumstances. Third, the case demonstrated the importance of teenagers developing emotional regulation skills, perspective-taking ability, and healthy responses to disappointment and failure. Part of growing up is learning that you won't always get what you want, that you will face setbacks and disappointments, that other people don't exist solely to meet your needs and expectations. Students who never learn to accept a bad grade, who never develop the resilience to bounce back from academic disappointment, who never learn that their worth as human beings isn't defined by their GPA. These students are at risk not necessarily for murder, but for ongoing dysfunction in their relationships and lives. Fourth, the case highlighted the deadly potential of folie à deux situations where two individuals reinforce each other's worst impulses and enable each other to do things neither might do alone. Willard might never have acted on his murder fantasy if Jeremy had refused to help and had reported the plan to authorities. Jeremy might never have participated in murder if Willard hadn't recruited him and pressured him to participate. Together, they created a situation where murder became possible in a way it might not have been for either individually. As of December 2025, both Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale remain incarcerated in Iowa State prison facilities, serving their life sentences. Willard is now approximately 20 years old and has already served over 4 years of his 35-year minimum sentence. He will be in his early 50s before he can even petition for parole, and there is no guarantee he will be released even then. Parole boards consider factors, including the severity of the original crime, the defendant's behavior in prison, evidence of rehabilitation and remorse, and the risk of recidivism. Given that Willard murdered his teacher over a grade, demonstrating such extreme entitlement and lack of empathy, parole boards may well conclude decades from now that he remains too dangerous to release. For Mrs. Graber's family, friends, students, and colleagues, the pain of her loss continues. Nohema Graber should have lived to retire from teaching, to enjoy her golden years with her family, to be a grandmother and friend and mentor to younger teachers. Instead, she died violently at age 66, murdered by one of her own students, in a park where she went for healthy exercise, killed because a 16-year-old narcissist couldn't accept that his grade reflected his actual performance rather than the grade he felt entitled to receive. The Fairfield community has worked to honor Mrs. Graber's memory through memorials, scholarships in her name, and ongoing support for her family. The Spanish department at Fairfield High School dedicated their classroom to her memory. Students who were impacted by her teaching have shared stories of how she inspired them, helped them, and made their education better. These tributes ensure that Mrs. Graber is remembered for the 4 decades she spent helping students learn and grow, not just for the horrific way her life ended. The boy killed his teacher for a grade, and when when his parents heard the full details of why, when they learned that Willard had planned murder for 2 weeks, had met with Mrs. Graber to discuss his grade while already intending to kill her, had beaten her to death with a baseball bat, and had done all of this simply because he felt entitled to a better grade than his performance had earned. Their recognition and support seemed to crumble, their body language reportedly showing the horror of realizing their son was capable of such evil for such a trivial reason. While they didn't formally disown him in the legal sense, the emotional distance and shock visible in their reactions suggested they struggled to reconcile the son they had raised with the murderer he had become. Willard Miller will spend decades in prison, paying for the 60 seconds of violence that ended Nohema Graber's life. He will serve his 20s, 30s, and 40s behind bars, missing all the milestones and experiences that define adult life: college, career, marriage, children, travel, freedom. He will be an old man in his 50s before he can even ask to be released, and he may well die in prison, having never experienced adult freedom. That is justice, though it cannot bring Mrs. Graber back or fully heal the wounds her murder created. The message from this case is clear. Grades don't define your worth. Academic disappointment is not a legitimate reason for violence, and teachers deserve respect and protection as they do the vital work of educating the next generation. Mrs. Graber gave her life to teaching, and one of her students took her life because he couldn't accept the grade his performance had earned. The disproportion between the wrong Willard felt he suffered and his response of murder reveals the depths of his narcissism and moral bankruptcy, and ensures he will pay for that evil with decades of his life locked in a massly cage, exactly as he deserves.